Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Inclusion Exchange. My name is Ayo Barley, and I'm the Managing Director of Bakri Barley, which is a Merseyside-based equity, diversity, and inclusion consultancy. And really excited to be bringing back the Inclusion Exchange for season 3. If you haven't checked out our previous seasons and episodes, please do. They're available on YouTube and Spotify. I think we're on episode 8 or 9 at the moment. And these podcasts are really about platforming experts in their field, really to delve into tips, to delve into experiences and insights that will really help organisations to promote diversity and inclusion, no matter what the setting. And I'm really excited to bring the first episode of 2025, which is going to be focused particularly on educational settings. And the title of today's episode is Reimagining Liberation, Building an Anti-Colonial Future in Education and Community. I'm going to be inviting our guest onto the screen in just a sec, but before I do, I would really love to give her the warmest of welcomes and the warmest of introductions. Today, we're going to be inviting Dr. Amal Abu Bakri to speak to us. And for those people who might have cited the Bakri connection, just wanted to make it clear that we're not related as far as we're aware, but Amal and I have got to know each other really well over the last couple of years, and really delighted that she agreed to be a guest on this podcast, because I'm really excited to learn more about her and the work that she does. So Amal is a lecturer in politics of race and decolonial studies at the University of Liverpool. And she's also a visiting fellow at the University of South Wales International Centre for Policing and Security. She's a former doctoral student at Aberystwyth University's Department of International Politics, and Amal successfully defended her thesis on the 6th of November 2020, obviously during a time in the world where there was a lot of heightened awareness of issues around anti-racism and diversity. So really interested in learning more about her experiences of studying at that time. Amal is a Saudi-born Nigerian dual citizen of Canada and the United Kingdom. And Amal is interested in all things international, and she tells me that she's interested particularly in international food and politics. So again, Amal, any tips around that would be really welcome. I'm sure we'd love to hear your preferences there as well. So Amal's current research profile is really interesting. Amal is in the process of writing a book as well, which we'd love to hear about. But that research currently is centred on using anti-colonial international relations theory to explore how particularly North American and European political and security organisations continue to empower racially configured exclusions and terror. So that's just a little snippet of Amal and what Amal is currently focused on. So please do come on to the podcast now, Amal. You are very welcome. It'd be lovely to see your face. Great to see you. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. It's our pleasure to have you here with us for this chat. So Amal, obviously I've shared a little bit about you in the bio, but I just would love to know a little bit about how you got into what you do, because it seems quite a niche area, very important and highly charged area, emotionally, as well as kind of globally when we look at what's going on in society today. So I'd just like to know a bit more about you, your origin. What was it that got you into this line of study and this line of work? So over to you.
I am a 9/11 baby, unfortunately, so it comes with certain connotations because I am obviously phenotypically Black and Muslim by birth. Essentially, me and several other youth members of society, I guess I'm not really a youth now, but when I was a youth, were very affected by the events of 9/11, in particular the counterterrorism response. Being born in Saudi Arabia and growing up in Canada, I think there was a lot of confusion, let alone being a racial minority within the Muslim community, around why being Muslim after the events of September 11th, 2001, warranted certain types of racial profiling and discrimination in countries that are known to be multicultural societies, or house, multicultural societies. and to have very strong, internationally renowned liberal democracies. So understanding the interconnections between anti-Black racism, anti-Muslim racism in the context of Islamophobia was something that was very dear and close to my heart just on a personal level prior to deciding to design this PhD project during my master's at the University of Warwick. We were told essentially that the key to designing a successful PhD project was to design a project that we would be willing to talk about for years. And I figured that if it was something at the time personal and close to my heart that I was passionate about, that it would be make for a good PhD. I was very fortunate that the project I designed, which was titled The Color of Counterterrorism, how do logics of racialization, I'm happy to explain the language if there's any questions, how do logics of racialization structure counterterrorism approaches in the UK and Canada? Was very fortunately for myself accepted with a full scholarship at Aberystwyth University, starting the trajectory of the career in academia that I have. And it's not the best backstory, obviously, in terms of talking about experiencing racism and wanting to learn more about it. But I think it's led to some really useful insights that have helped me as a researcher and an educator now at the University of Liverpool, and it has been a good platform for creating dialogue about these sensitive topics.
Thank you. No, thank you for sharing that. And I think taking us back to, I suppose, 9/11 and that whole time in globally and how people were affected in different ways and how that can actually, urge people in different directions around unpicking what happened there and how can we actually prevent some of the discrimination and the Islamophobia that was so rife globally from happening again. And of course, it's so topical at this time, given what we've seen globally over the last year at least. So yeah, thank you for sharing that, Amal.
Of
So
course.
so the next question really is around decolonizing and some of the language that we're using today around anti-colonial education. And I think before we set up this call, I know we've had some discussions informally, and I was unsure what the difference between decolonizing and anti-colonial thought. The language changes, and I know that there's significance in the different language that's being used. But I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what decolonial education is or what decolonizing is and how that perhaps differs, if it does, from anti-colonial education. So yeah, can you tell us a little bit about the language and unpick that for us a bit?
Okay. So when we're talking about decolonizing, particularly when we're not in an academic space or we're talking something very unspecific to international relations theory, what you have is essentially a decentralized movement to recontextualize social, cultural, economic, even political, all the kind of ways in which we approach social phenomena in the world within the imperial and colonial contexts in which they emerged. So it is usually discussed academically, and it is an academic term coming from a certain school of scholarship that is interdisciplinary. So there is an interconnection with anti-colonialism, but it's usually spoken about in an education-oriented context when we talk about decolonizing, coming from decolonial theory. There's a decolonial school of thought emanating from Latin America, but there's also an intersection with what would be called anti-colonial resistance or anti-colonial theory, which is theories of anti-colonial resistance. So in terms of the relationship, what you have when you're talking about anti-colonialism is a field of study that's based on the activity, so usually outside of academia, uh, anti-colonial, so people who were subjugated by colonial powers, specifically resisting to that, whether violently, via philosophy, whether cultural movements, whether by political engagement, usually within the global south and or marginalized sectors of what we would say the metropole or the epicenter of colonialism. So when we're talking about anti-colonial studies, what we're talking about more specifically than the decentralized movement for recontextualizing is talking about studies of domination and control completed um, to literally remove colonial dependence and address the idea of colonial independence or incomplete liberation from colonial occupation. And like you would see definitely people that are known to decolonial schools of thought, but also post-colonial schools of thought, which is usually connected to English literature studies, but also more geopolitical talk is about, all focused on different aspects of understanding the ramifications of colonialism and imperialism in international politics. Some key figures, in case anyone's interested in reading up, would be William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, Claudia Jones, Frantz Fanon, Anwar Abdul Malik, Edward Said, CLR James, and Césaire, and many, many more. And the idea is to think about how people who are operating outside of the university and outside of academia uh, actually are putting up knowledge that's relevant to resolving um, different international affairs and crises of the world. So I think the key thing to remember in terms of difference between decolonial and anti-colonial is the kind of resistance to being immersed in colonial society that usually anti-colonial thinkers are adjacent to or discussant of and focused on, and the idea of it being usually knowledge that's emanating from lived experience, from lived political resistance, from lived struggle, usually from activists or those we would now see as activists, freedom fighters as well. So there's a very action-oriented emphasis
Hmm.
on anti-colonialism that isn't always
Hmm.
there with decolonial thought, although
Hmm.
it can be.
Thank you so much for just breaking that down. That's helped me so much to
No
understand
worries.
the difference, that academic focus of decolonizing and that action focused of anti-colonial thought. And you mentioned there about maybe some of the ramifications of maybe not taking this approach around anti-colonial thought and supporting that progress in that area. And I'm just interested, obviously, decolonizing and the awareness around decolonizing has particularly come about as society has been reawakened around structural racism and how that exists in education and all elements of our being. But
Mhm.
what would be some of the ramifications of not doing some of this work around anti-colonial thoughts? What do you see as being the outcome if we don't become more aware of this, the importance of this?
I think one of the issues that came up, especially with the public reaction to the events of the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement during the area of the global pandemic. I mean, we're still in it, but I'm talking about the different reactions and social movements that were occurring during 2020 in particular, is how people felt about the way different neoliberal and or capitalist-oriented institutions were responding to a critique of the addressing of colonial society, and how people who were well-meaning, who wanted to be allies to anti-racist movements or the acknowledgement of the current ramifications of colonial violence in higher education, weren't always fully understanding what it meant to decolonize.
Hmm.
So I think one of the reasons that it's really important to acknowledge the difference of anti-colonial is that because it's a response to a kind of disappointment held by those who want the universities and the institutions where they work to address decolonizing, so that it can be further extenuated what it means to be an ally and what it means to be anti-racist and what it means to be decolonial and what it means to be anti-colonial similarly.
Hmm. Hmm.
When I said that my PhD discussed logics of racialization, even though it sounds really complicated, what essentially you have was a very particular moment in higher education where we're thinking a lot about the ramifications of racial thinking. So logics of racialization is just a fancy way of saying that we need to look at the logic and the foundations of it, where the foundation and philosophies and values and beliefs that are integral to how we view the world come from, and whether they're based in systems of racial oppression, and what that means for whether we have a particular view or a biased view or a misinformed view on the way in which people who don't look like us, people who emanate from different cultures, different people who live in a different way, go about existing in the world, and whether that will often lead to political violence in how we perceive these people, respond to these people, manage their societies. If we're thinking more, again, in the line of military intervention, which unfortunately has been a recurrent discussion this past year, and how we even do societal intervention in societies that already have lines of division as a result of colonialism and empire. So Britain, for example, being in Liverpool as a former slave port linked to the Confederacy on not the positive side of the American Civil War, has a lot to do with this event, even though it's not based in the global South. So it's not just talking about what's going on a world away, but also talking about how colonialism has affected society in our own backyards and how we can create more conscious solutions for addressing race relations as a result of our colonial past.
Thank you. Thank you, Amal. So I'm going to move us on a little bit, and it's related to what you just mentioned there, because I understand that you've recently completed a research project with the University of Liverpool, which the report was titled An Appeal to Anti-Colonial Education at the University of Liverpool. I know that you worked with a working group around that, and I'd be really curious to find out how that came about, because a lot of what you've talked about already is historically accurate and relevant, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy to accept and to respond to, particularly for institutions that have upheld kind of a certain way of thought. So I'm just interested how that particular research project came about at the university, focused on anti-colonial education, that kind of activist element, which goes beyond decolonizing. And also, what was your experience, particularly of working with Black communities when you did that particular project?
Yeah. So it came about because our university did a call, University of Liverpool, for initiatives of research collaboration, so interdisciplinary research collaboration. And I had put forth the idea that we should have a research collaboration focused on pedagogy, so the philosophy of teaching at the University of Liverpool, and where our university has struggled to incorporate decolonizing higher education as a movement into its different fields, schools, and classrooms. And it was a bit complicated because there was a misunderstanding, I think, by the administration at first concerning whether doing research on how we teach constitutes research. Obviously, pedagogy and the kind of politics around learning is a very specific field, usually North American oriented, even though we do educate and try our best to educate researchers on how to be the best educators they can be through different higher education certificate training. But I think there was just a little bit of making the university aware that you can research how to teach ethically as a field of research. And this is a long-standing field of research that is highly beneficial to be included in how we view ourselves as educators and the university as an equitable, safe space for higher learning. And then it was much more well received. So we were able to receive a good amount of funding to conduct research on anti-colonial pedagogy and its prospects. And I knew a series of like-minded academics at the University of Liverpool, and I had wanted to get the opportunity to work with them out of my own enthusiasm for trying to learn more. There was also this great, but also really sad and depressing, as with most of the topics we'll be talking about in this podcast, article written in The Guardian that prompted my way of thinking, that came out in 2021 concerning I believe it's by David Betty, talking about the failure of the uptake of decolonizing the curriculum movements at universities. So despite 150 universities making a potential commitment back in 2020 to decolonizing their higher education, I think it was found that only about 20 to 28 had actually gone about pursuing this and taking it up. And that usually there was structural issues, misunderstandings, and resource-related issues that prevented not only departments from taking it up, but also individual academics from being able to successfully pursue these kind of endeavors. And the idea was, okay, if we try to look into why this is happening, not across the country, like that Ardian article did, but at our own university, what would we find? So I had the idea of essentially creating a space where we brought academics together in a series of three public, but more university focused, with one being community focused discussions where we could talk about the barriers to decolonizing education, what decolonizing education looks like in our specific fields, and what an anti-colonial education or the notion of an anti-colonial education could do for reopening up dialogue for those who feel like I do, that the decolonizing movement in higher education has hit a wall. And I was very delighted that in the first meeting, when I did a call out asking for people to come and join, and not only just come to talk about it, but potentially form a working group, that several people came and about 20 people committed to helping me write an eventual policy report on our activities. These came from the backgrounds of geography, sociology, criminology. I believe there were attendees from the languages department, the biosciences, and I'm hoping I'm not forgetting anyone, and as well as some community-based educators that you and I know that were very passionate about improving relationships between the university and Liverpool's historic Black community based within Toxteth or the L8. And that kind of group led to the continuation of discussions within the community. So we had our first meeting on campus where we collected, I'm not sure what you would say, but collected interest amongst academics in October.
Mm-hmm.
We had a very successful event at the Kumba Amani Millennium Center in November, where we had, I believe, around 32 people come from all different walks of life. But meet primarily with community-based organizations and advocacy groups based within the L8, such as LA Education Hub, the Green Bank Project, who else? I believe Capoeira for All, the Mandela 8, and just individual activists who've been working with LA, within the LA a long time, to gather their perceptions of the relationship of University of Liverpool to the city of Liverpool and disenfranchised communities. And we made sure at each of these events that we had a community expert. So in particular for that event, we had the amazing historian Janaya Piquet talking about what anti-colonialism meant for her personally as a local historian and current master's student within the University of Liverpool. And we wanted to essentially emphasize that an anti-colonial education was grounded in the relationships between the university and the community, because even though anti-colonial thought is premised on a kind of global outfacing network of looking at how anti-colonial solidarity happens, for example, overseas or in different social movements outside the colonial metropole or the colonial epicenter, which England is in our case. It also necessitates looking at context-specific solutions. So Adom Getachew is a good proponent of this in her arguments called World Making After Empire. So we tried to do the same, where the local context of Liverpool and its colonial relations and how it was affecting how higher education was perceived is the reason why we needed to talk to the L8 community that's literally less than 5 minutes away from campus, about their perceptions of the university. And then the third event that we had was a kind of more teacher education oriented focused event that happened in May of 2024. Sorry, I think I've mixed up the timeline because we're in 2025 now. So we're talking about the events of 2023 and 2024. Where we had the amazing Dr. Sarah Salem from London School of Economics, who's been actually teaching on anti-colonial pedagogy for quite some time in the context of talking about archiving and historical research that's focused on absorbing anti-colonial philosophies into how we understand history and memory at her university. She visited and gave a talk to us as a kind of more academic expert for all of us newbies on what anti-colonialism would look like when conducted in higher education or university spaces specifically. So it was really important to us to have a well-rounded view of what anti-colonial education could be for those of us who were introduced to it or knew of it. And we really wanted to know how both the public and scholastic community reacted to anti-colonialism before compiling our own, what eventually became 51-page report for how we could see anti-colonialism at the University of Liverpool.
Wow, thank you so much for that overview of the work that was done there. And we'll include a link to the report as well in the show notes so that if people want to find out more about that and the recommendations, of which there are many excellent recommendations in that report. But I just wanted to ask you a follow-up question, really, because you mentioned, I think the second event was really about engaging with the local L8 community, understanding perceptions of the university. So a lot of organisations in the space of equity, diversity and inclusion are increasingly wanting to do kind of co-production work, working with historically underrepresented or marginalised communities to try and build better systems, processes, and outlooks for organisations to ensure they're more inclusive. So I'm curious to know, particularly when it came to that event and that focus of the project, which was about engaging with the local communities, what were the key barriers, if any, and what factor did trust play in actually starting those conversations and starting to perhaps rebuild some of those or build some of those connections that perhaps hadn't existed previously?
Trust played a huge role, and it was developed, I should be clear, long before this actual project began, directly between myself and other like-minded or academics who are engaging in similar research projects at the University of Liverpool. So the individual organizations that were invited, just to be clear, are people who trusted us and were willing to hear us out. For example, in terms of being my involvement with the LA Education Hub, I had been working with them in previous years. I'm a volunteer at the Greenhouse Project led by Paul Kahn, and oh, I forgot the Tiber Project that is led by Cherie Smith. So it was people that we knew from being faces within the community, and them being willing to connect with us. So if when people watch your podcast, they may wonder why I wasn't invited. We did do public callouts. We did ask people who were willing to come speak. We did individual visits to organizations, trying to convince them to come. We made sure that everyone was financially received financial reimbursement for their time as well. So we only had 10 speakers, I believe, that we could invite. We can pay for their time to come meet with us. So there's financial incentives for people coming to the table, because unfortunately, there's a huge amount of distrust between the university, its researchers, its departments, and the LA community due to events of structural racism that university has been involved with in the past, being an institution that wasn't so much focused on race relations up until the very recent years. And now there is a greater push for dialogue from the university. There are endeavors that are being taken by the University of Liverpool that are positive to create a positive relationship between the university and the LA community. But it was from our understanding, and particularly to the discussions between ourselves and the community during this project, that these efforts have been slow. They've often been misguided due to a lack of actual dialogue with the LA community and a misunderstanding of what support they want and what support they actually need. So there was also a lot of issues concerning what actually is relevant to being an issue of higher education that I think doesn't come often. So an issue, for example, of urban displacement, usually people would say, oh, that's a social housing issue or something unrelated to education. The members that showed up, particularly Sonia Bassett of the LA Mandela LA, excuse me, were very clear to say that when you isolate communities surrounding a university, you're showing them that they're not meant to be there. And even though that's unrelated to how we teach, And the curriculum, it's very related to student recruitment, public perceptions of who belongs within the university. If you essentially go out of your way to economically segregate members of the community, they won't have a positive view of what higher education is for.
Mhm.
So it was very enlightening. It was very important as well to see that many of these people, even though they might not see themselves as activists, and they might just see themselves as caretakers for their people and their community, have the ethos of what anti-colonial education housed within themselves and what they do. So it was very much fortifying to the idea that uh, what lived experience can mean for benefiting a community, not just within a Russell Group university, but outside that, and creating a relationship on reciprocity and democratic education as well, not just one that requires a very heavy tuition to access. So I think it was very enlightening for all of us, including myself, to have these perspectives because I don't know. I mean, you have mentioned, and I have mentioned as well, I'm Canadian technically, and from my upbringing, I'm not a native to Liverpool. So there was no way in which we could have an understanding of the colonial imperial context of relations here without actually talking to people who were born and raised here and have been here for generations.
Mm. Thank you, Amal. So much within that answer around the need to think very carefully about how to work appropriately with communities, have that dialogue around what would make the project, the engagement opportunity equitable and accessible for people, but also understanding that it takes time and there's a context to all this. So although you may well have had, and it sounds like you had relationships with community groups and individuals, the institution will have a different persona to many of these communities. So that also needs to be acknowledged and looked at. So I want to ask you a question, just particularly because we work with, and there'll be people tuning in from a wide range of organisations, some educational, some higher education, some further education, perhaps some schools, and also other types of organisations. If people are listening to you speak and thinking, well, we'd like to do something around anti-colonial thought, we'd like to start on that process or start to think about reflections on that, what would be your key advice to people about how to get started? What would be needed, and what type of results can people expect from actually delving into this area?
I think a lot of people interested in decolonization notably got frustrated when they saw themselves as individuals working against a system, even though they thought that the system, higher education, university, was a positive thing for creating moments for decolonial, anti-racist, and just a more diverse learning environment that was fairer and more understanding and globally conscious. And I think that small wins, small goals are really important. I think even coming into this, I myself was a bit concerned, especially in community relations, because the goal of of showing the university that community relations are significant and valuable and important to how a higher education institute operates is something that I didn't think would be so difficult. And it was also really heart-wrenching to know that people within the community that's so close to where I've worked for 3 years felt so devalued that it can be hard to manage your emotional expectations when you're engaging in these processes as well. There's a lot of sensitive issues that will come up. One of the things that I noticed that was really important was that it was very significant for academics that are not within the community to learn that people outside the university see academics. And I'm sure if you're not an academic, businesses, I'm assuming EDI actors, as part of the problem. And I think that there's a lot of defensiveness as being seen as possibly a contributor to colonial violence that comes up where we feel a kind of, oh, I don't want to be seen that way. But there's something about understanding that to no fault of your own, by the choices that we've made and the privileges that we have, we've been put in institutions that have legacies of oppression. And the idea is not to say, well, I'm not a part of the problem, but to say, I play a small role in an institution that has been a part of the problem. What can I do going forward? This means recognizing that when someone's critiquing you, they're critiquing you as part of a system, they're not critiquing you individually. This means not becoming defensive when people accuse you of being part of structural racism and institutional racism, which is usually what happens when you get into dialogues about these projects. And I think that people often get so worked up about being seen as violent actors or racist people, part of because we were taught that those who engage in those kind of issues are bad people, that we get distracted away from the what the purpose is, which is repair and reconciliation, and dealing with what can we do for others rather than what can I do to myself. I think that anti-colonial education and decolonizing is supposed to be a selfless act. I think it's supposed to be a responsibility of education. So it's often not fruitful. I think that usually when the university is interested in this research, it's a good thing. But in many cases, it's possible that they won't be because they won't see the positive prospects of engaging in these kind of things, not just for research impact in the case of me being a higher education or public image, but just for understanding what is its value. And it takes a lot of hard work to show the university that there is value in it. That can often feel like you're swimming in an ocean. And I think it's important not to get discouraged. I think it's important to see the small wins and the small dialogues and the small connections and the continued relationships as being the goal rather than being the means to an end, because it's such a big end. Kehinde Andrews, he's an amazing sociologist at Birmingham City University, has a really great way of explaining in his scholarship on Black studies that even though people are cogs in institutional racism and we don't always have a choice of our relationship to our role in institutional racism, we have a great purpose as academics and university educators of teaching people how to survive inequitable systems or oppressive spaces that I think applies to not just Black studies, but as university educators as a whole. If we're teaching people how to survive, it will come with a lot of empathy and compassion for how we can survive too. So we are part of the problem, not just in being part of the solution, but self-reflection is key, and self-empowerment leads to the empowerment of others. So I think that it requires being very open-minded, willing to pose for ridicule that not a lot of people will like, but it possibly means that if you're feeling that way, that you're possibly doing the right thing. It's a very uncomfortable process, and I know I'm not selling it maybe to everyone, but just acknowledging that discomfort will happen if you're engaging in anti-colonial work, and that this is part of the process is really, really important so that you don't feel let down or you don't feel uh, gutted when you're engaging in these dialogues. That means a lot to those who are on the receiving end of it, that these endeavors happen.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that and some really practical reflections there on well-being and making sure that actually the resilience of actually doing this work is thought of in terms of how perhaps how people can support each other in this work as well. So how by joining networks, I imagine, and having peer support in this work would help the longevity of it. But the impact, like you say, is important, and it comes back to that trust issue as well with the communities that are most benefited by this type of work, and providing that equity is really important to those groups. So that should keep us going. So yeah, thank you. So I usually like to finish the podcasts with some practical steps, and you've already given a few, Amal, there in your last answer. But for organisations or individuals who want to improve their personal understanding of colonial thought, what practical tips or steps would you suggest for them? And is there one particular action that you would want to encourage people to take, particularly when they want to improve experiences of marginalised and racialised communities within higher education?
I read a lot. I know that's not for everyone, but it's really helped. Um, I've gone out of my comfort zone as well by entering spaces I'm unfamiliar with that are impacted by colonial context and imperial context. And I've been invited, fortunately, but also sought out spaces in colonial and anti-racist spaces that I'm not familiar with. which even for me as someone who's phenotypically Black and looks like a racialized minority, and I am, it's challenging. I think there's an assumption, especially when you're phenotypically white, that, oh, this place is not for me. This role is not for me. And it doesn't work like that. If you're in a position where you have the ability to do something, taking the endeavors to be informed and educated about it, so that you can do something about it, isn't the responsibility of people who look a specific way or have a certain established role within higher education. And I think the track record shows that I'm still a junior scholar in my field, even though I've been fortunate to be hired as a university lecturer. I've only been in this role for 3 years. There are people who have been in university higher education for decades that have much less to lose, considering that they're established within their field, who I think need to often take the sacrifice or take the moments to be vulnerable by entering these spaces. And I hope podcasts and platforms like this will encourage them to try and take the initiative so that it doesn't fall on people who are just interested, but also still in precarious positions to take up the responsibility. I think all university educators have to play their part, and all people in society have the ability to. It just involves educating yourself, if not books, through podcasts even, and just caring, really. It's important to care about each other.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a great place to end the interview. So thank you so much for sharing all that wisdom, sharing kind of your personal origin story and also your journey recently through doing your work around anti-colonial, the anti-colonial working group, particularly in the Merseyside area as well. So all of the references that Amal mentioned will be in the show notes. And I'd just like to thank you again for listening. And thank you, Amal, for sharing your story with us today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.